He remembered the scent first.
Not the gunpowder, not the diesel, not even the stench of corpses that clung to every ruined farmhouse in southern Italy.
No. Farley Mowat recalled the aroma of wet soil churned and scarred by shells mixed with decaying olive leaves and the faint metallic tang of fear that never truly left his mouth. It was December 1943.
Somewhere between the shattered ridge line south of Ortona, the Canadians called it the Italian meat grinder. The Germans called it an ideal defensive battlefield. Farley Mowat would remember it as the place where something inside him finally fractured. The rain had been falling for days. Cold, piercing rain that soaked into greatcoats and froze the bones beneath. The sky was a low, unbroken sheet of gray that pressed down like a lid on a coffin. The only thing darker was the ground. Black mud twisting around boots, swallowing footsteps, devouring hope. Mo stood there, clutching his binoculars, trying to act like the officer he still believed he was. But the battlefield around him was unraveling faster than he could comprehend.
A mule cart lay overturned in a ditch, its driver dead beside it.
A Canadian stretcher-bearer trudged past, eyes hollow, carrying what remained of a man he had been laughing with the day before. German machine gun bursts crackled from somewhere up the ravine, echoing between stone walls like snapping bones. There were no birds, not a single flutter, not a single chirp. The skies of Italy were silent, eerily, unnaturally silent. Moat later wrote that this silence felt wrong, as if nature itself had abandoned the place. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first shift, a hairline fracture in the mind of a young officer who had already witnessed too much. He didn't know it yet, but he was walking straight into the darkest day of his war. A day of orphans, of sudden death, of trauma so profound he would spend a lifetime trying to write it out of his soul.
Southern Italy was never meant to be a secondary front.
Yet for the Canadians who fought there, it became one of the most brutal proving grounds of the entire war. A place where nature, terrain, and the German army combined to crush even the strongest men. Farley Mowat arrived in Italy believing that the worst was behind him. He had already survived Sicily, malaria, and months of constant movement. But nothing prepared him or any Canadian soldier for what awaited them on the mainland. A battlefield built to break men.
Italy was a defender's paradise.
The land rose sharply into hills and broken ridges scarred by centuries-old terraces that created natural killing zones. Every valley was a funnel. Every slope was exposed. The winter rains turned fields into sucking swamps. And when fog rolled in, visibility shrank to mere meters, giving German snipers and machine gunners every advantage in the world. To make matters worse, the Canadians were not fighting against a crumbling enemy. They were fighting against Fallschirm, Germany's elite paratroopers, battle-hardened, disciplined, and masters of defensive warfare.
These weren't conscripts. These were the men Hitler trusted to hold the line at all costs. And they did.
Village after village, ridge after ridge, the Fallschirm Jäger turned even the smallest house into a fortress and every stone wall into a sniper's nest. They fought for every inch, forcing the Canadians to pay in blood each time they advanced.
Mowat's role teetered on the edge of death. Mowat served in the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, the Hasty Peas. But his real burden was his position, forward observation officer. Few roles in the Canadian Army were more mentally punishing. An FO had to move near the front, often ahead of the infantry, to spot German positions and radio coordinates for artillery fire. That meant MO saw everything first. The dead, the wounded, the terrified civilians, the spots where shell bursts had torn men into unrecognizable shapes. It also meant he was a priority target. German machine gunners, mortarmen, and snipers knew that killing the artillery spotter could collapse an entire attack. Mowat operated under constant threat. Sleep came in broken fragments. Meals were whatever he could force down between bombardments. And fear was an unseen shadow that grew larger with each passing day. But even worse than the danger was the responsibility. One wrong coordinate, one misread map grid, and Canadian shells could fall on his own men. MO carried that weight like a stone in his chest. The mental spiral began. By late December, MO was exhausted beyond what a human being should endure. In his memoir, he describes moments where he no longer recognized his own reactions. He walked past corpses without feeling anything.
He found himself talking to himself during pauses in the fighting. He could not remember the last time he slept more than an hour. And worst of all, he felt his empathy fading. This is the psychological stage soldiers fear most. Not fear itself, but the absence of feeling. Combat veterans call it the gray zone. A mental numbness where the brain detaches to protect itself from overload. Once a soldier enters that zone, returning from it becomes harder each day. The stage is set for collapse. The days leading up to Farley Mowat's darkest moment were a perfect storm. Endless casualties in his regiment. Cold rain and mud that drained every ounce of strength. Civilians caught in the crossfire dying in the ruins. The Farley Jaggers' relentless resistance and complete mental exhaustion. All of this built toward a breaking point, a single day when the war would challenge every remaining part of his humanity. That day began with a quiet walk into a ruined village and the sight of 2 starving orphans who would haunt him for the rest of his life. The day that nearly broke Farley Mowat did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence. A silence so unnatural, so heavy that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. His unit had been ordered to move through a shattered Italian village, a nameless cluster of stone houses that had been shelled so many times it barely existed on the map. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a world of dripping rubble, cracked walls, and olive trees. Splintered by shrapnel. Mo walked near the front of the column, scanning the ruins for German movement. The Farley Jagger often left booby traps behind, tripwires on doors, grenades under buckets, mines hidden beneath. Loose tiles. Every step could kill a man. But today, the village was still. No dogs, no voices, no birds, only the soft crunch of boots on broken stone. Then they heard it. A sound so faint the men almost dismissed it as the wind. A thin, wavering whimper echoing from inside a collapsed farmhouse. One of the privates froze. Another raised his rifle instinctively. Mitt held up a hand to stop them. The sound came again. Not wind, not an animal, a child. The discovery. Mowat and 2 soldiers moved toward the rubble. A section of the roof had caved in from an artillery strike, leaving a jagged hole through which rainwater dripped steadily. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke. And there, in the corner of the ruined room, were 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell. Because they were starved almost to the bone. Their faces were gray. Their clothes were rags. Their eyes were enormous, hollow, fixed on the Canadian soldiers with equal parts terror and exhaustion. Mo had seen dead soldiers. He had seen men torn apart by mines. He had seen friends bleed out in his arms. But nothing in Sicily, in the mountains, on any battlefield, prepared him for the sight of these 2 silent, trembling children. A soldier breaks his silence. One of the privates, usually the toughest man in the section, knelt down and removed a chocolate bar from his pouch. He tried to hand it to the boy. The boy didn't move, not even an inch. He just stared, eyes wide, breathing shallow, as if the simple act of reaching for food required a strength he no longer possessed. The girl's lips were cracked. She blinked slowly, once, twice, and then her eyes drifted unfocused to the floor. Mo later wrote that this moment hit him harder than any shell burst he had survived because this horror was not enemy action. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't soldiers fighting soldiers. It was children, innocent, starving children caught in the war's gears. Forgotten by both sides. War was not supposed to look like this, but in Italy, it did. The collapse no one expected. The private finally broke. He lowered his rifle, pressed a hand to his face, and began to cry. Quietly at first, then uncontrollably. Another soldier touched his shoulder, but couldn't find words. Knowing something twisting breath shorten, he felt his breath shortened. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as though the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. This was the moment the fracture in his mind widened.
He could endure fear. He could endure exhaustion.
He could endure the death of comrades. But this raw, helpless sorrow was too much. The truth struck him with devastating clarity.
He could not save everyone.
He could not even save these two children. And for a man who still believed somewhere deep down that decency mattered, that realization was unbearable.
A moral injury. Modern psychologists call it moral injury.
The shattering of a soldier's internal moral compass when confronted with suffering they cannot prevent.
But Mo didn't have those words. He only felt the wound. He felt something inside him
slip, like a rope suddenly losing tension. He tried to speak to the children, but the words caught in his throat. He placed the chocolate bar on the ground and backed away slowly,
feeling ashamed. Ashamed of the war, ashamed of his helplessness, ashamed
that the best he could offer was a piece of ration. As the men moved on, he looked back over his shoulder. The boy, gathering what little strength he had, took one
unsteady step toward the chocolate bar. That tiny movement, weak, desperate,
determined, burned into Mo's memory more deeply than any battlefield death.
The haunting.
Years later, long after the war, long after he became a celebrated writer, Farley Mowat admitted that he dreamed about those children.
He dreamed about their hollow faces, their trembling hands, their silence.
In a war filled with blood and fire, it was the quiet suffering of two orphans
that nearly broke him completely. And the day was not over. The worst was still coming.
The encounter with the orphans left Mo shaken, but there was no time to dwell
on it. The war did not slow down for anyone. Not for exhausted soldiers, not for starving civilians, and certainly not for a shaken young officer trying to keep his mind from splintering apart.
By early afternoon, the regiment pushed
deeper into the foothills leading toward Ortona.
The mud was thicker here.
The ground chewed open by days of artillery.
The valley narrowed into a natural choke point, a perfect position for the Farley Jagger to inflict maximum damage.
And they did. The ambush.
It started with a single mortar round.
An unmistakable hump that echoed down the ravine. Mowat stiffened. Every Canadian soldier did. A second later, the shell landed 50 meters behind them,
exploding in a violent spray of dirt, rocks, and razor-sharp steel fragments. Men hit the mud instinctively.
Someone screamed.
Then the second round fell.
Closer. Then a third.
Within seconds, the Canadians were under full mortar
attack.
Mitt pressed himself against a stone wall, shouting coordinates into
the radio. But the fog was thick.
The German positions were invisible.
He was
throwing guesses into the void, hoping his artillery batteries would land shells close enough to suppress the
enemy without hitting his own men.
As he tried to steady his voice, something terrible happened.
The loss of a brother. In arms.
The mortar barrage shifted, creeping forward with deadly accuracy.
A burst detonated 20 feet away, close enough to rattle Mo's helmet. When he looked up, he saw a man lying motionless in the mud. Sergeant M. McDougall, a veteran.
One of the toughest men in the regiment, the kind of soldier new recruits instinctively stood behind because it felt safer.
Matt had spoken with him minutes earlier. Now Mac's body was twisted unnaturally. Shrapnel had torn into his side. Blood soaked the mud
beneath him, turning the ground into a dark slurry. There was no dramatic last word, no hero's farewell, just silence.
A brutal, crushing silence. Mo froze. His breath hitched.
His throat tightened.
Something inside him felt like it collapsed inward. He wanted to run to his friend, but training and terror kept him pinned to the wall. Enemy mortars still hammered the ridge. Anyone who moved risked joining Mac in the mud. The emotional shutdown.
A young private scrambled to Mac's body, calling his name again and again, but there was no response.
After a moment, the private looked at Mowat, not for orders, not for direction, but for permission to break down. Met couldn't speak. He couldn't even blink. He later wrote that he felt nothing. Not grief, not anger, not fear. Just a numb, hollow space where emotion used to be, a void.
Psychologists call this stage dissociation.
The mind disconnecting itself from trauma to survive the moment.
But to a soldier, it feels like betrayal.
It feels inhuman.
Mowat stood there staring at the body of a man he respected and felt absolutely
nothing.
And that terrified him more than the mortars did. The burden of responsibility. The barrage continued.
More men were hit. A stretcher bearer collapsed with a shredded leg. Another soldier took shrapnel in the face and screamed for a medic until his voice cracked. Met forced himself back into motion. Duty demanded it. The artillery had to respond or the entire company could be wiped out. He lifted the radio. His
voice trembled as he read coordinates. A shell landed wide.
He corrected. The second landed short. He corrected again. Every correction was a gamble. Every gamble could mean more casualties.
His hands began to shake uncontrollably.
He dropped the pencil he was using to jot down map points. It fell into the mud, instantly lost. Another man died. Near him. Another friend.
The numbness broke just for a moment and a wave of
guilt crashed into him so violently he nearly vomited. Was it his fault? Was his delay to blame? Was his inability to focus costing lives? He would ask himself these questions for decades. The breaking point grows near.
By late afternoon, the casualties had reached a horrifying tally.
The regiment
had lost men every day in Italy.
But today was different. Today the losses felt personal, intimate, brutal, and MO was unraveling.
Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the children again. Every time he opened them, he saw the bodies of his comrades. There was no escape. The war had trapped him in a tightening vice, pressing from the outside with fire and steel, and from the inside with guilt, grief, and
exhaustion. By the time night fell, Mo felt like a ghost walking through the smoke, half
awake, half dead, waiting for something to finally snap inside him.
And that
moment would arrive sooner than he expected because the night would bring not rest but the onset of the trauma. That would haunt him for the rest of his life.
When darkness fell over the Italian hills, it didn't bring peace. It brought the kind of night that soldiers dread. Wet, airless, suffocating. A night where every sound feels amplified and every shadow seems alive.
Farley Mowat had survived the orphans. He had survived the mortar barrage. He had survived watching his friends die in the
mud. But survival was not the same as endurance.
His mind had been pushed to
the brink all day.
And night was the final weight that would tip him over the edge.
A night without stars.
The Canadians dug shallow pits in the hillside, trying to carve a temporary shelter from the cold.
The rain returned.
After dusk, falling in thin needles that soaked through greatcoats and pulled in every depression of the ground.
The mud
was freezing. Every breath came out in pale steam. Mowat sat in his slit trench. Knees drawn up, his radio wrapped in a ground sheet beside him.
He felt tremors running through his hands. He told himself it was the cold. It wasn't.
Above him, the sky was a uniform sheet of black. No moon, no stars, no light. The only illumination came from the occasional artillery flash in the distance, illuminating the hilltop for a
fraction of a second before plunging everything back into darkness. And beneath the night, the battlefield breathed.
The distant moan of a wounded man calling for help, the rumbling of
tanks somewhere far away, the drip of rainwater hitting helmets, the groan of
trees splitting from shrapnel damage. To Mowat's shattered nerves, every sound felt exaggerated, sharpened, hostile. The return of the children.
As he sat in
the dark, the image of the two starving orphans returned with brutal clarity.
He saw their hollow faces, their trembling limbs, their silent stare. He tried to push the memory away. He failed. The girl's eyes floated in the blackness like two pale lights.
The boy's thin hands seemed to reach for him from the
shadows. Mo clutched the rim of his trench, breathing harder. He realized,
suddenly, terrifyingly, that he wasn't controlling his own thoughts anymore. The bombardment begins. Just past midnight, the German mortars
opened up again.
A shrill whistle cut through the rain, then another.
Then an explosion so close it kicked mud into Mo's face. The ground jumped. The air tore open. Shrapnel screamed overhead. Mo flattened himself into the trench, arms over his head.
He felt the vibrations in the earth travel through his body like an electric shock.
He tried to steady his breathing. He couldn't.
His lungs seized, his chest tightened, his vision tunneled. The bombardment worsened, closer, louder,
brighter with every detonation.
Men were shouting all around him.
Someone yelled for a medic. Another
screamed that they were being bracketed. The shells were walking toward them,
each one landing closer than the last. The breaking moment. Then it happened. Another mortar landed. Nearby,
a violent eruption of dirt.
The shock wave slammed into Mowat. He choked, gasped, and felt a surge of panic so intense it wiped every rational thought from his mind.
He curled onto his side, shaking uncontrollably.
This was not fear. Fear was something he understood. This was something else. Something primal and overwhelming.
His mind was breaking its final
connection to the world around him.
He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He felt as if the walls of
the trench were closing in. He couldn't move his hands. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe.
He pressed his face into the mud and shut his eyes, wishing
he could disappear into the earth.
This was combat shock, the precursor to
full-blown PTSD.
In 1943, nobody had a name for it. Soldiers simply said a man had cracked.
That night, Farley Mowat cracked.
The illusion of death.
As the bombardment intensified, Mo's mind detached from reality.
He felt weightless, suspended somewhere
between consciousness and oblivion.
The screens around him faded. The explosion sounded distant, muffled, like thunder underwater. And then he saw, not with his eyes, but with a mind warped by exhaustion and trauma, the children again. They stood at the edge of his trench, observing him with terrible calm. Rain fell through their ghostly outlines.
The boy murmured something. Mo couldn't grasp the words, but the tone stabbed into him like a blade. He wanted to scream. He couldn't utter a sound.
This hallucination, this fusion of trauma, guilt, and terror was the moment his psychological defenses finally crumbled.
A hand in the darkness.
Suddenly, a hand gripped his shoulder. Mitt jerked violently, convinced it was a German soldier in the trench.
But it wasn't.
It was Private Stevens, a young man barely out of his teens.
"Mowat, sir, are you hurt?"
Mowat stared at him, eyes wide, unable to form a sentence.
The bombardment eased for a moment. Stevens helped him sit up. Mitt's hands clawed at the sides of the trench as if anchoring himself back to reality. "Sir, you're trembling." Mo couldn't deny it. His whole body shivered like an engine misfiring. He felt ashamed, exposed, shattered. But Stevens didn't judge him. He simply remained with him, sharing the narrow trench until the worst of the panic subsided. Sometimes a soldier doesn't need orders. He needs a witness to his suffering. The dawn that changed everything. By dawn, the mortar attack had ceased. The rain eased. A faint gray light pushed its way through the clouds. Mo sat in silence, his uniform drenched, his nerves frayed, his mind hollow. He wasn't the same man who had entered the trench the previous evening. Something inside him had snapped cleanly in two. That morning, as he stood unsteadily and looked across the battlefield, he realized a truth more terrifying than enemy fire. He no longer trusted his own mind. And that was the moment Farley Mowat understood, not in words, but in a chilling bodily way, that a part of him would never return from Italy. Dawn in Italy rarely brought sunshine. On the morning after Mowat's breakdown, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray, colorless, almost indifferent. The rain had stopped, but everything else remained unchanged: the mud, the wreckage, the distant rumble of artillery. But something inside Farley Mowat had shifted completely. He climbed out of the trench slowly, as if gravity had doubled overnight. His legs quivered. His fingers wouldn't unclench. His eyes wandered without focus. The world looked unreal, flattened, dreamlike, as if viewed through a pane of grimy glass. He wasn't wounded. He wasn't bleeding. But he knew instinctively that he was no longer whole. The invisible wound. Most Canadian soldiers carried visible scars, shrapnel burns, bullet grazes, twisted ankles, frostbitten toes. Mitt carried none of these that morning. Instead, he carried something far worse, an unseen injury to the mind. In 1943, the term PTSD didn't exist. Shell shock was still regarded with suspicion. Officers who broke were quietly reassigned, lectured, or told to pull themselves together. But Mo knew this wasn't weakness. What he felt was something deeper, something dark and primal, like a door in his mind had been forced open, and he no longer knew how to close it. He felt detached from his own body, overwhelmed by sudden waves of dread, haunted by visions of the orphans, the dead sergeant, the screams, terrified of the next mortar round, ashamed that he couldn't control any of it. When a friend asked if he was all right, Mo answered automatically, "Fine." It was the biggest lie he ever told. Trying to continue the war. In the following days, Mo attempted to resume his duties. He studied maps. He relayed coordinates. He walked the front lines. He forced himself to eat. But inside, the collapse echoed. Every sound made him flinch. Every body made him stare too long. Every starving civilian reminded him of the children. Every mortar whistle triggered a jolt of raw panic in his chest. He managed it well. Years of discipline helped, but the cracks had widened. He was no longer operating on will or courage. He was running on instinct and exhaustion. At night, he couldn't sleep. When he did, he saw the ghosts of that dark day. A medic once found him sitting upright in his tent, shaking violently, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Yet the war went on. The regiment needed him, and he kept going because that's what soldiers did. They moved forward until they physically couldn't anymore. Returned to Canada, but not to peace. When the war finally ended and Mo returned home, people expected him to resume life as a young Canadian veteran with a bright future. But the war did not stay in Italy. It followed him home. He suffered from recurring nightmares, sudden panic, cold sweats, blackouts of emotion, a profound sense of guilt, especially for the children he could not help. He described moments where he would suddenly find himself overwhelmed by memories so vivid they felt real. Loud noises made him jump. Crowds made him tense. Silence made him remember. For years, he carried the burden privately, telling almost no one. The purpose of his writing. Farley Mowat eventually became one of Canada's most cherished authors.
Yet, the emotional core of his work was shaped by Italy, by trauma, loss, and the horror of what war does to the human soul. And No Bird Sang was not just a memoir.
It was an exorcism.
Through writing, Emo forced himself to confront the darkest memories he had tried to bury: the orphans, the mortar barrage, the friends who died the night he broke.
He wrote because he needed others to understand that war wasn't glorious. It was corrosive.
It didn't just destroy bodies. It destroyed minds, beliefs, identities, and the innocence of young men who left home believing they would return the same.
The legacy of a dark day. Farley Mowat lived a long life.
He built a career, became a storyteller, became a symbol of Canadian literary courage. But he never forgot Italy. He never forgot the day that nearly broke him. And in telling his story, he gave a voice to thousands of Canadian soldiers who suffered silently. Those whose wounds could not be bandaged, whose scars could not be photographed, whose pain lived forever in the quiet spaces of their minds. His darkest day became a warning. No soldier escapes war untouched. Some just carry wounds the world can't see.